Christopher, thank you for coming back on the program.
Hey, you know what? You've been doing this for a while now. It was fun. We've now exchanged content a couple times. I was on here once. You've been on mine. Now I'm back. It's been fun. It's been fun getting to know you through this too.
Likewise. And you are one of the few people that I feel like I have to forcibly cut the conversation off with, which is very frustrating for me because we have such in-depth conversation. It's like, oh, 2 hours have passed. I should probably let him get back to all of his other tasks. But anyway, the focus of this conversation, I wanted to be kind of like a preparation episode for Gen Z in a way. I think a lot of
Okay.
them are thinking about becoming parents. Maybe they haven't decided, but it might be in that, you know, faculty of thinking for them. They're hopefully thinking long term. And so for someone who, well, I'll let you say it. How many kids do you have?
So we have seven right now. And people always ask, is that it? And I say, I'm not answering that question because the second I answer it,
Yeah.
we will have more. And so when people say, are you done? I say, I don't know. But yes, as it stands today, we have seven.
Right. I mean, just kudos to you for that, first of all. Um, so you are a hyper parent. I guess that's an appropriate term. You're not just parenting two, you're parenting seven. And so the
Yeah.
structure of this conversation, I kind of wanted to go over how do you parent? How do you use technology? And then how should parents use technology? And I think it's an appropriate question to ask, the latter question, because most people try to dismiss technology. I don't think that
Yeah.
we should be doing that anymore. I think the conversation has to start revolving around how do we use technology in a healthy manner? How do we teach
Yeah.
our kids to use technology in a healthy manner? So let me pass it back to you. What has being a parent taught you? I guess that's a broad question, but you can take it in whichever direction you like.
No, it's funny because one of the lessons that it's taught me, it took me a while to want to learn it, which was one of the biggest things was humility.
Mm,
Um, and learning that my existence is not to serve myself, which people look at me and have seven kids and go, "Oh, you must have just always wanted kids." And when I think back to when I was in my 20s, my wife and I were like, I'm not really sure the kids thing is really for us. We've got these plans, we have this thing we want to do, we have the way we want our life to go. And kids really felt like a barrier to
mm,
us. It kind of felt like, how are we going to accomplish that? Maybe when we're ready,
mhm.
we'll have kids. And I have a saying that man plans and God laughs. And that's kind of how it worked for us. And that it was like, yeah, we're going to wait for a while. And then we found out we were pregnant. And it was like, well, I guess that's not going to work type of a thing. But as we got into it, it took a few kids where I was going, this is really frustrating because I have all these things I want to get done. And these kids keep like getting in the way of it, honestly, was sometimes how it felt. And it was only after having a few of them. And I mean, it's not that I love my kids to death, even back then, but it was very hard. And then all of a sudden I went, wait a minute, what if part of my purpose is to actually prepare all these wonderful little humans that I've been given for the future? And my attitude just completely changed. But again, it took me kind of going, wait a minute, maybe what I want to do isn't actually the best path to take, which I think will be very relevant when we start talking about tech. Because then it was like, well, wait a minute, if I start seeing my purpose in being not only what I do, but also how do I prepare these people who have been put in my circle? Because honestly, who do you have more influence over in your life than little human beings being raised in your house? And all of a sudden
Right.
I was like, wow, this is an amazing opportunity. And it also doesn't have to be as much of a barrier as I thought. And so that was just a fundamental mindset shift that my kids have and continue to teach me because even now, there's times where I have to rethink things because I go, well, I want to do this or this is really important, but there's seven little human beings that I need to work around.
Mhm.
but I also want to model what good looks like for them. And so it actually forces me to be wildly creative, which is super cool.
No, that is super cool. And there is something that you touched on, many things that you touched on, but one thing in particular was this idea of a barrier that you had to get over. And I've
Yeah.
also had that too. For me, it's more of a loss of identity. I feel like I would
Yep.
lose my ability to live my life on my terms if I had a kid or
Yeah.
seven. How how did you get over this idea of the barrier? And I asked the how question in the sense of, was it with age? Was it, as you said, with or after a few kids? Was it after deep introspection? Like, were you cognizant of this barrier and then you slowly started working towards it?
So I don't know that it was necessarily, well, there's a specific moment where I remember things kind of shifted. And
Mhm.
some of it is my personality. But as I started growing in my career, one of the things I started observing was a lot of these traditional wisdoms or truths, business truths that I'd been told weren't really coming to life. So, it was like, oh, well, you're only going to be able to do so much and you're going to have a hard time having a career with kids. And I actually was finding like, well, actually, I am doing fairly well. But then I had a mentor who actually sat me down once and I had told him what my aspirations are. And I've got pretty aggressive aspirations. And he just looked me square in the eye and he goes, just so you know, at some point, you're going to have to choose whether you're going to pursue those aspirations or you're going to be a family man. It's a choice you're going to have to make. And that actually ignited a fire in me where I was like, excuse my French, but like I was like, bullshit. I'm like, I refuse to buy into this nonsense because if you tell me you can't do something and you can't even give me some sort of explanation, it's just like he said this with just such, this is just how it is. And when I hear this is just how it is, I'm like, I am going to prove that that is a load of crap. And in some ways, that was the beginning of me starting to go, no, I'm going to chase and pursue what I think I've been brought here to do. And I'm going to have a fulfilling family life where my family comes first. And I'm going to prove that you don't have to. And I don't want to say you never have to sacrifice because there's certainly times I go, well, I trade off type of thing. But this lie that like somehow you can't be successful professionally if you have a family.
So it is interesting that you kind of indirectly answered one question I had, which was, do you regret having kids? A lot of
No.
people, right, you said vehemently say no. But a lot of people, I think back on when they had one kid or two kids and they say, what could have my life been like? What could I have accomplished? What more could I have done for myself, for the world, if I didn't have these, apologies to kids, but a little they're distractions, distractions from what
Yeah.
we want to do. So it is interesting because I'm starting
Something
to
on
wonder.
that though,
uh,
something on that though, I want to add is something that I had a unique experience of growing up that I think has always kept me thinking beyond just like what's ahead of me was I grew up in a funeral home.
mhm,
And actually, one of the things that that mentor saying, like, you're going to have to make this choice, one of the things that stood out that actually kind of fueled me to kind of go, was I was around death a lot and a lot of people who were in the kind of end of their ages. And one of the things I remember explicitly is no one ever said, I wish I had less kids
mhm,
in those end of days. Nobody ever said, you know what, I wish I'd had less kids or I wish I didn't have kids. No one ever said that. If anything, all I ever heard people say is, I wish we hadn't stopped having kids. I wish we'd had more kids. And so it was one of those things where I was like, there's something. I may be too young to really understand it at this point.
mhm.
But if all these people at their end of days is not regretting this, going, boys, I sit here kind of watching my silver cord about to be snipped, I just really wish I could have accomplished so much more professionally, because by that stage they realized that all these things that we often in the early parts of our career think are the most important, they had kind of gotten to that point where they're like, I mean, this isn't what's going to be there for me in the end. And so I think that that gave me a little hope that I was like, all right, I'm taking a gamble on this, but my experience has shown me it's a safe bet.
I hear you loud and clear. And there's, I think, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but right now we're talking about kids in a vacuum in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I want to bring in price. That's a stupid word to
Yeah.
use right now, but the cost of having children. A lot of Gen Z
Yeah.
right now can't even afford a home. I think I remember like there was an article 36%, but maybe I'm
Yeah.
confusing the statistic. Many Americans are using buy now, pay later for groceries. Like
We're in a really tough spot.
we're in a tough spot, thank you. And so when thinking of having kids, people like the prospect, people may want a big
Yep.
family. I know many people that say they
Yeah.
want, 7 to 10 kids. They want a massive family, like the Godfather size family.
Yeah.
But economic reality comes into play, and they're like, I can't afford a house. How the hell am I going to afford a little human?
Yep.
Let alone more than one.
Yeah.
So
I
how do
was
you?
right there.
Okay, can you say more about that?
So we found out we were pregnant at probably the worst time in our marriage. I mean, I literally had just paid, I had taken out as many personal loans as I could possibly take out to try and consolidate debt.
Mhm.
I made a rent payment on my credit card that hit the max. And I'm like, and then my wife goes, uh, we're expecting a baby. And I remember just going, you have got to be kidding me right now.
Yeah.
Like, because and again, this goes back to, I had built this up based on all these things I'd heard. Kids cost $1 million to raise.
Yep.
There's all this stuff you have to do. If you scroll on social media, you see people decking out their baby nurseries, and this all, oh, we have to buy all this crap. And I remember being like, I'm screwed. I mean, I still remember being like, I'm done for. This is it. And then we had Jackson, and it was like, again, similar to these other things. What I found was a lot of these things that I'd been told, I kind of had to make a choice of, am I going to live up to some artificial expectation that somebody else set somewhere? Well, you got to have a this, you got to make sure they're doing this, you got to make sure all these other things. Or are we just going to go, we have been gifted with a little human being, and we're just going to love this thing, and we're going to figure it out together, and it might be rough and we'll do it. And what I found was it was not as expensive
Mm.
as in my head I'd been thinking it was going to be. And it really wasn't. And so that actually was a shift for me when I went, well, I guess it could be really expensive if we choose to live up to someone else's expectations, or even some artificial expectations I've created.
Mhm.
Or we can just look at things and go, well, what does the baby really need? Well, they need diapers, and they need to eat, and some clothes. I mean, it really was, when we really simplified, it actually turned out this was, again, one of these fears that had controlled us in some ways. I mean, we had waited to have kids for a bit because we're like, oh, we got to be in a good place financially. And then again, God's kind of like, oh, I'm going to bring this on you at the absolute worst period in time. So I think to anybody listening who's feeling that pressure of like, you just can't do it, I know the feeling, but we're 7 in now, and we figured it out. And I didn't have a successful career for quite a while um, into having kids.
I'd like to switch gears and
Yeah,
inject technology into the conversation since we're 20 minutes in.
sure.
So I know you're obsessed with technology, as am I. So
Yep,
I'd like to ask you a rather difficult question, just so
sure.
I've been throwing you, easy
Why
layups.
not?
When did you realize that technology in its current form was having a substantially negative impact on yourself and society at large?
I think I've seen that potential from probably as long back as I can remember. I mean, I was one of those kids that I had, I was coding and hanging out with tech in my basement, back in middle school and high school. So even right away when I looked at it, I went, this is super cool. And this could be, and I guess I've always just been a person who studies human behavior.
Mhm.
And I started watching just in general how we just as human, I mean, technology doesn't, it changes the way we do things, but really all it does is turn the volume up on it.
Mm.
I observed how even as a kid, I loved it, but I mean, I'd be like, even with my friends, I'm like, can we turn off the Nintendo?
Yeah.
Can't we just hang out as friends? And I saw how it was like, well, wait a minute, like we're together and yet we're completely isolated or so for me, I always saw that potential. And even I was one of the ones that when Facebook came out, it was still like, does my college have it yet? And you had to
Uh,
wait to get the invite type of, and I remember being like, wow, there's something about this that is very cool and also very isolating and lonely. And I even saw in myself going, whoa, I'm basing like how I feel today based on whether people liked my Christopher is, blah, 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 blah. And you're like,
yeah.
nobody liked maybe I should do something else that'll be more. And I'm like, whoa, am I actually changing the way I'm thinking about my day based on this
Yeah.
stupid piece of technology so I've always had this keen awareness of this can be really cool, but if we are not extremely careful and discerning with this, it will destroy us completely. And so that's just been my experience.
So, when did you acquire the maturity, or at least maybe the understanding to use technologies? Like, let's talk about specifics: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, Snapchat. I don't even use Snapchat, but maybe you do. Um,
No.
when did you learn? Let's specify further. Um, Digital devices like the iPhone and the laptop, and then social media
Yep.
platforms. That's what I'm referring to. Because
Yeah.
technology, I guess, is very broad. Microwave is
Yeah,
technology.
because like even out of the gate on this,
Yeah.
like my freshman year of college, eBay was just becoming popular. And I teamed
Right.
up with somebody and I started this like international business that actually had the FBI show up on our campus and drag me out in zip ties.
Oh,
So like
please.
I
No,
was
we're touching
very
on this
familiar.
story. We're touching on this story. We have to. You can't just bring it up and nonchalantly.
Well, so I'll answer your first question though. But again, so already I had this keen like, whoa, this thing has the power to amplify stuff on a level I'd never seen. Um, so specifically the social media and the smartphone thing, and I forget now. Now you threw me with I threw myself with the beanie bit. What specifically was the question? And then I'll make sure I answer it.
How did you? When did you realize? Sorry. How do you
Mm.
use technologies in a healthy way?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So I won't even pretend that I always had this mastered because even in the early years, I knew there was something about it that had a lot of potential for whatever, but I very quickly, and even in my early years, was like, technology is a tool to be used for something that I'm trying to do. And so for me, I always saw that relationship of, okay, if it starts controlling what I do based on what it does, I probably need to evaluate what's going on here type of a thing. So that I don't think there really was an age where all of a sudden that kicked in. I always knew it, but if anything, I always surrounded my people self with people who knew me well
Mhm.
and weren't afraid to speak into my life when they saw things were like, hey, I'm seeing something in you. And so that actually helped because I had blind spots just like everybody does, where all of a sudden you're like, oh, let's do this thing. And it's like, Christopher, you hate doing that.
Mhm.
Why are you doing it? Well, because that's what's happening, when everybody else and people be like, okay, don't be something you're not. So I was fortunate and smart in bringing those people in my life because that helped. But
Right.
even to this day, I still have those people and I'm constantly evaluating my own behavior against that because if you're not relentlessly intentional about that, that's what I found. That's when I go astray. That's when, smartphone addiction, when it's like, hey, can you put that thing down? And I'm like, oh crap. Like this is no
Mhm.
longer a tool for I need to do something. This is something that's now capturing me and I need to be weary of.
This relentless, I'll skip the FBI thing, but this relentless intentionality is something that I
Yeah.
really want to drive home because it is so easy to get sucked into TikTok and Instagram and Netflix. I think the average person watches 5 hours of video content a day. That was the
Yeah.
statistic, which
It's
is,
nuts.
it is, that's mind boggling. That's almost like a part time job per day.
Yeah.
So now let's come back, or let's put these two topics together. We've talked about healthy use of technology and we've talked about parenting. When did you realize that you needed to really critically think about how to teach your kids to use technology in a healthy way? Like when did you come to this like realization of, oh, if I let them use this unregulated, unrestrained, they are going to suffer very severe consequences?
So I think I was fortunate in that just because of my understanding of technology and the way I had always looked at it and the mistakes I'd made in my life, that even the second I had kids, I was like, and I made some mistakes, or actually my parents made some mistakes when I was growing up because again, I was the tech head.
Mhm.
And so my parents knew nothing about what I was doing. They had no clue what it was. So it's like, why is the telephone light on at 4 in the morning? Oh, do you know, Dad, I'm just doing some things with the internet. And, he's like, okay, what I don't know what you're doing. I don't understand. And I don't know enough about it to speak into it. So I'm just, and that actually was really dangerous for me because that was where it was like, I didn't have that parental discernment and wisdom kind of being in like, hey, I may not understand this, but I need to talk to you about how to think. So for me, the second my kids were born, I'm like, I need to treat technology like a powerful, powerful, powerful weapon or tool. And I knew I would never just hand my kids a, bandsaw when they're 3 years old and go, here you go, like have fun in the nursery. I'll be outside type of a thing. So for me, even in the beginning, it was like, I mean, obviously when they're super little, what are they doing? Maybe watching,
Yep.
Blippy or something like that. So there's not a whole lot of parenting you have to do. But as they grew up, I knew this is an area, and to this day, every night I sit down with my kid, we talk about tech and its usage and where it's going and what it means and
Yep.
all of these things because I'm like, you are going to grow up in a world that is wildly different than the world I did and wildly different than the world you're in right now.
I would love to touch on that towards the end, but I'd like to get in the weeds just a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
S- So you have 7 children. They're all using
Yeah.
technology, but they're all using, as you were saying, when they're young, they're not using, they're not playing. They're just like watching
Mm.
stuff. But if they're a little bit older, they're actually interacting with the device. So
Yep.
how do you manage the different ages of technology? That's a
Yeah.
horrible sentence, but like, how do you manage one or a couple children actually using the device, a couple children watching the device, and then being like, because kids get jealous of other kids, like, oh, why is your tower bigger than mine with the
Yeah.
better blocks and stuff?
How come
You know
you
what I'm
get
trying to
this
say?
game and I don't get this game and all
Precisely.
this other stuff? Funny, my kids teach me a ton that I apply at work, and work teaches me a ton that I apply at home. And this is the same conversation I have to have as an executive leader all the time, where people, well, how come this person has this title and that's the thing. Adults are the same as kids. We're not any different. I have these conversations at work. Why does this person make this much money and I don't? Why do I get this type? Why do they get to work from home and you're like, well, let's have a conversation
Mhm.
about where we are from a trust standpoint and your behavior and these other things. And let's have a conversation about the desired outcomes. And so that really becomes a thing that, the one thing I would say, especially to Gen Zers who may be in the stage where they're just having kids or they're thinking about it, if you're looking to me for like, what's the one rule? When do you give a kid an iPad? How
Yeah.
old should they be before they, guess what? It doesn't exist. And I think that's the hard lesson is being a parent is really hard work. Just like being a leader is really hard work because you have to get to know your kids. You have to understand them and their vulnerabilities and what they're really good at and where they're not strong. And you have to kind of custom tailor this, but you also have to be a parent, which isn't that much difference from being a leader where I mean we got parental controls on the kids' iPads and we have certain
Mhm.
guidelines that we have for them. And when they ask, I mean, I remember the first time they wanted to have the social settings on their Minecraft. And we're like, okay, how do we feel about this? Like, let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think this was something that also is counterintuitive that I have found works really well as a parent. I actually engage with my kids in that conversation.
Mhm.
Why do you want that? What are you hoping to do? What are things you're comfortable with and not comfortable with? And let's create these guardrails together so that you feel like you're part of it, not just dad and mom said, but let's talk about it. And guess what? If you blow it, if you do something, like I remember the first time my son got banned for doing something that he shouldn't do, I'm like, guess what's going to happen? And he's like, I know because I help make the rules.
Right.
You're going to turn off my social settings for a bit. And I'm like, yeah, yeah. But then we're going to talk about it and revisit it.
Oh, this is so interesting. So you're engaging in dialogue with your children about using technology, not just in a healthy
Yes.
way, but in general. You're talking to
Yeah.
them, and well, I really want to get to these talks that you have with your children because we touched on this in the
Yep.
podcast episode where I was the guest. Just as a tangent, we see so many people having kids as like an influencer. So using their children as props for their influencer job, which feels like an oxymoron. So just as a parent, how do you feel about like what is happening here? Is this can't be healthy. So
No.
if there are people that are seriously considering having a kid or maybe adopting a kid, which would be horrible to use them in their influencing journey, how do we go about dealing with this? What do you say
Yeah.
to them?
So here's the thing, and this has to do with just my worldview on things, where I see every human being as being created for their own distinct purpose and having their own unique value. And nobody is a tool to be used. And so it's not just your kids, because if you have that mindset about your kids, you probably have that mindset about other people too. And it's just one of these things that's just not productive at all. If you see people as an asset or a tool to be used for some bigger purpose to serve yourself, you might want to have a long, hard conversation with yourself and go, what the hell is wrong with me? Like, what am I doing? And I think it's easier sometimes to do that with kids because you have this attitude of like, well, I'm their parent.
Mhm.
I'm providing for them. Like the least they can do is pay me back. And that's a dangerous attitude to start getting where you're like, no, no, you've been gifted with a human being who is under your care and you have a unique window of time that you can help take care of them and mold them in a way that hopefully they go off and do amazing things, but they're not a tool to be used for that. Now, if you look at my social media stuff, do I reference being a dad? And occasionally do I tell stories about my kid? Of course I do, but it's not a prop for my social media presence. It's more because I see them as these wondrous creatures that teach me things. And I'm like, I learn from them and I want to share that with somebody else. I'm even being on this podcast. For me, it's like, I'm not, hey, dad of seven, like this is my PR brand so that people give me a book deal or a Netflix. But it's like, no, but I've learned so much through this, and I know other people are going through this stuff. And I think that goes even back to, what are you doing to be an influencer? I actually don't think there's anything wrong if that's what you want to do,
Mhm.
but is it to glorify yourself, or is it to ultimately make the world a better place and help other people through whatever they're doing? And that's just, again, kind of a different way of approaching things.
Would you let any of your kids be influencers?
Again, I think they're unique in their own sense. And if that really was what they wanted to do, I love them enough that I would let them do it. But I would be right there alongside them, challenging them, just like I just did right there, and going, why do you want to do this?
Right.
What are you really trying to accomplish by doing this? Because I remember my son, he wanted to create a YouTube channel like daddy. And I was like, okay, but like, why? What do you want to do? And some of it was just letting him experiment. He was big into Legos and he wanted to create a Lego play channel type of a thing. But he got into it, and I discipled him through it because he started having this, well, people aren't watching my videos. I'm not getting all these followers. And I was like, okay, like let's talk about this. And ultimately, through his own wisdom, he went, I don't want to do this anymore. And I'm like, cool. Instead of going, no, we're going to feed this because you're going to be my child influencer that I can then use to build 1 million follower YouTube subscribe. And it's like, no, no. But again, it was through relationship that we got to that point. I didn't say, Daddy says no YouTube. You're not doing this. I'm like, well, let's figure out a way that you can experiment with that, just like you should with, I want to learn to ride a bike, or I want to learn to go to the skate park. And you don't just give your kid a skateboard and go, good luck, see you later.
Mhm. Just touching on this job situation, we are coming to a
Yeah.
point where a lot of jobs are about to be taken or are already being taken through the use of artificial intelligence. How are you
Yep.
preparing your children for this, increasingly inevitable world? What are you telling them? How are you engaging in dialogue of, hey, maybe the things that you're studying right now, the things that you're learning right now are not going to be relevant in the next 5, 10, 20 years. How do you future proof them?
Yep. So some of the things I'll hit on is, one, I talk with them a lot about what technology is and how it works and all these things, because I think if you understand it, you then can start to see how you thread the needle through it. So, you know, we have long talks about this stuff and what this stuff is, because honestly, the rules apply to technology like the rest of the world. Like, technology is not this thing where you go, oh, cool, I can just like skip over all the consequences because tech will let me. It's like, no, it works the same. So some of it is helping it with that. But again, I get to know each one of them personally
Mhm.
and really dig into what it is that makes them tick. But then I also create this environment of experimentation because I'm candid with them. I'm like, everything you think you do, you may actually never do that. Even with school, I used to be a school teacher, and I left because the school hated me, because I was always like, yeah, the stuff you do, you're probably never going to do in real life, but I'm going to help you understand the purpose of it so that you understand how to apply it later. And so it's the same with my kids, where it's like, yeah, let's not get too focused on what job you're going to do, but let's focus on what things really you enjoy doing and you're really good at. And then let's experiment with different ways and constantly be trying new things, so that instead of seeing going down a path and then having to change direction as failure, you just see that as, well, that's just life. You just continue evolving as you go. And I think that, I mean, again, there's the oldest is 13, so it's not like he's off and he's gonna have to face, they're all gonna have to face these challenges that
Mhm.
I did. I mean, I slept in my car for 3 months. I was broke as snot, trying to figure this stuff out. And I'm not gonna be the dad that's just like, yeah, I'm gonna bankroll you into some 6-figure job. But it's those are some of the things that I'm doing to help them navigate that, because it is scary. I mean, it's scary for adults. I
Yep.
can't imagine what it's like for kids who are going, whoa, this is wild.
Yeah, but before they even enter the job market, it's just fluid and dynamic from the get-go.
Hmm.
Like some adults are just beginning to coexist with AI technologies, and then as a 17 to 18-year-old in the next couple of years, you'll be entering a job market where coexisting with AI technologies is like the status quo, which is a very different
Oh,
world to
yeah.
be
And I
living
think
in.
coexisting with humanoid robots is not, I mean, I think
Yeah.
by the time my kids get there, that's not going to be weird. That
Right.
you might have robot coworkers and not just like in your screen, but like walking. I mean, it's like, yeah, you might. And how are you going to navigate that? By being a problem solver, by being creative, by knowing how to engage and work with people. And again, you focus on those core things, you'll be just fine.
So I know you're obsessed with technology and you've been thinking about these things a lot, but there are also a lot of things that, we don't know. We can't predict the future.
Yep.
How do you parent without fully knowing the answers? Because that's one of the things I've heard from, I don't know many fathers. I know some of my
Yeah.
friends are fathers, for better or for worse. But they always talk about you have to kind of fake it. You have to give confidence even though you may not have it in you. Is that something that you have dealt with, something that you have struggled with? Like, how do you parent and give kids something that you don't have internally
So
yet?
this to some of this counterintuitive stuff. I mean, I grew up, seeing, and then I also grew up with the guidance of, you're the parent, you got to have it all figured out. You can never let your kids see you're weak or vulnerable. Kind of the
Right.
same bad leadership advice you get. You're the boss. You have to have all the right answers. You got to, whatever. And my experience has actually been quite the opposite of you don't have to have all the answers. And guess what? Again, going back to my belief that like my kids are intelligent, creative human beings. Heck, half the time they see things I don't see. So I'm actually extremely open and vulnerable with my kids about, oh, hey, I might not know this, but here's what my wisdom and experience has taught me. I think, for me, being grounded in something truth, being grounded in a truth that's sustaining beyond just the cultural moment of whatever's going on, so that you can kind of go, well, here's what I do know. And here's where we are right now. And you know what? Honestly, my kids would quote me on it. I tell them all the time. I'm like, the more I know, the more I learn I don't really know anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our best. We're going to try and analyze what we're doing. And daddy's going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. And when we screw it up, we're not going to hide it. We're going to admit it. We're going to say we're sorry and we're just going to keep trying and we're going to be here together. So I don't think this idea that you got to like have every answer to every question and show your kids that you've mastered everything. I actually don't think that leads them down a right path, actually.
Uh, this is going to be a personal question. At least for me,
Sure.
this is kind of like a therapy question for me, not for the
Yeah.
podcast. But how do you deal with making mistakes with your child? That's something that really scares me, even more than losing my identity, which is like I never want to steer my kids in the wrong direction or give them bad advice or, you know, say something that may lead them to fail in a certain way.
Yeah.
Ha-
So
Yeah.
that was one that for a long time, and even to this day, I don't think that ever goes away.
Mm.
It's always in the back of your head of like, what if I screw this up? Um, for me, going back to worldview thing, in some ways, I take a lot of peace in the fact that it's like I'm in less control of this than I think. There's something bigger going on than, and I honestly, from an ego standpoint, I'm not that important. So while yeah, I can mess things up, to think I can cosmically wreck someone is like, well, I mean, I guess I can, but ultimately, I can also hold that with an open hand because I went through total shit growing up. I mean, my life was a nightmare. And I recognized the responsibility I played in going, okay, well, I can let that define me, or I can learn from it and adapt. So some of it is a little bit of accountability on my kids going, they're also responsible for their life. I mean, their existence is not 100% dependent on mine. And I think that frees things up a lot is it's like, well, okay. And I think then going back to it, if I am doing the very best that I can, and then also being vulnerable with them. And that's the thing. My kids, I openly tell them all the time, I am going to screw things up. There are going to be things when you get older. There's things now where my kids will come talk to me and be like, man, dad, like that really hurt my feelings, or this really bothered me. And I'll go, well, let's talk about it.
Mm.
I'm not perfect. And we can all just acknowledge that stuff. So that's where
Yeah.
over time, as I've leaned into that, it becomes less and less of a concern because I'm ultimately not accountable
Mhm.
for where their life goes. And so I can hold that with an open hand. I don't just kind of go, well, it's your problem. Do whatever you want. It's not my fault. No, I am responsible, but I don't have full control of that.
Thank you for that. No, you eased a lot of my tensions. Honestly, this podcast is just telling me to have kids, like as many as possible. Okay.
There you go.
The next time that we have a podcast episode, I'm gonna be like, there's four on the way, and you're gonna
Yeah,
be like,
there
oh my
you
God,
go.
yeah, like how did this happen? I saw
The
just
thing is
you,
though, I
yeah.
actually love that people are starting to be more excited about this because
Mm,
I think there was this, and we see this just with birth rates, like they just, because I think there was this culture around the world of like kids are just this dangerous thing that we just need to, oh, we don't want to have too many of these things. And I just go, it's too bad. So I actually think it's exciting that people are starting to go, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe there is something about this. And yeah.
do the declining birth rates scare you in particular?
No, they don't scare me. To me, it's just more of this cultural moment where you go, yeah, I think in some ways it's a reflection that we've lost our way a little bit.
Mm.
We've become so obsessed with ourselves and what we want that the idea of bringing someone into this world that is outside of ourselves is like seen as a threat. And it's like, okay, I mean, I think that's kind of where we are. And do I think it's a risk with we might see more of that with AI? Maybe because AI is training you to give you whatever you want. And so the more you get you want, but I also think that leaves you hollow sometimes. And I think that's what encourages me. So no, it doesn't freak me out. I mean,
Aside,
definitely from a career standpoint, it's a little bonkers, but
what do you mean from a career standpoint?
well, so I look at the gray tsunami happening right now, and you have all this intellectual capital, all these people coming out of the workforce, and there's just not as many people
Mm.
coming back in. And so you're like, well, I mean, in many ways, it's kind of forcing the AI change because it's like, well, there's just no people to do the stuff. But then I also have the concerns of, yeah, but who's discipling these people through the early stages of their career? Because, man, you want to talk about being a parent being a rough one. I mean, you can probably relate to this. I remember my early 20s finishing school and going, what the heck is this
Yeah.
wild roller coaster ride that I'm on right now?
It's
Like
the
it
Wild
was it
West.
was a mess. And at the time I didn't have any clue what I was doing and I didn't
Yeah.
have anybody to help me. And it's a crazy time. And to think there's just going to be even less people there guiding people through that stage of like, hey, here's how to make sense of this. It's terrifying, whatever. So that's the part that I'm like, oh, it's going to be interesting to see how we do it.
So going back to this cultural moment, why do you think, aside from AI, why do you think that we've shifted towards this, um, you know, I guess social norm, societal norm where it's about me? Because I think I embodied that mentality from the get-go, which is I would lose my identity if I brought a kid in. I would lose my um, I wouldn't be able to achieve my aspirations if I brought a kid in. So I'm right there in
Yeah.
terms of the average person you're talking about. What caused this?
Um, I don't think it really is new. I think
Mm,
going back to the very beginning of human society, we're selfish. I mean, you see that when you have kids,
yeah.
it doesn't take you long to realize, like, oh, wow, this isn't something they're taught. This just is our tendency is like me, me, me. I want, me, me, me. And I think what we're seeing is going back to even the influencer example, I think we had a cultural moment where having kids was like the thing to do. You know, post World War II, it was like, well, got to have the family with the kids and the white picket. And it was like almost societally what you did. And so I think we were just as selfish back then because I talked to, well, and I'm a kid of a boomer, but you talk to kids of Gen Xers and all this other stuff. You hear a lot of things where it's like, yeah, you had parents, but they didn't really they weren't invested in you as a kid or you were just like a tool to them to make sure that when they showed up at church or at the day, weekly picnic that you had your like nice little kids all dressed up that you could go, look at what I've got. They were like a trophy
Mhm.
type of a thing. So I actually don't think we're in this like new moment where selfishness is new, but I do think there is a state where, and I think in some ways, the pandemic started to reveal to us how hollow that can be. And there was this kind of awakening to, wow, this idea, if I just get enough of what I want, maybe then I'll be happy.
Mhm.
You start to realize, like, oh, or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just be more miserable because every milestone I get to, I realize, well, that wasn't the milestone that made me happy, and then you just keep going and you're like, well, now I'm still not happy. And so that's where I don't think it's new. I think it's just a different flavor. Kids just aren't cool like they were in, post World War II. And now maybe culture is changing a bit.
I would hope so. I mean, I think we have to get out of this mentality of kids being cool and get back into, if we don't have kids, we're going to like kind of self-terminate ourselves. Like
Yeah.
one of the most important things is like, procreation. I think we might be the first species in the universe that fails to procreate themselves, and that's the cause. It's not nuclear war, it's not nanotechnology,
No,
it's not synthetic
I
biological
know
viruses.
our own species because we're too obsessed with like, looking good on a computer. And then we realize like, oh
Yeah.
crap. But this goes back to we tend to have a quarter to quarter type mindset.
Mm.
We're not thinking. And that's, I think, the thing with kids is, when you're young, I remember going,
Yeah.
well, I'll wait. But you kind of forget that it's like you don't have unlimited time to have kids. It's not like, oh, well, I'll have them when I'm set. It's like, well, no, there's like a window you can do it. And that window starts to close. You can't get it back. There's no like, oh, I guess we waited too long. You can't go back in time. And again, for me, the funeral director thing, I saw too many people get to the end of their life and go, I really wish I had more time. And it's like, yeah, you don't. So do with it what you can and do it wisely.
Absolutely. Coming back to this, so you sit with your children and you talk about
Yeah.
technology. You talk about using technology in healthy ways. Obviously, we don't mean to pry in terms of what those
Oh,
conversations
it's fine.
entail, but what broadly do you talk about? How do you manage those expectations? How do you yourself come to compromise with them, even if you don't necessarily agree with their usage? How do you say, okay, well, I can hear you, I can understand your point of view, your perspective. How about we do it X, Y, Z? You give a little, they give in a little.
Yeah. So what's interesting about our talks is that, it's one of those things where it's not just like, let's go sit upstairs and now dad's going to give us another talk about like the latest Gen AI models and what Cloud 3 is doing and, what Figure AI is doing. It really is like, let's get together and talk about life. Like, what is going on in your world? What is interesting to you? And I tell them about my day. They tell me about theirs. And they're actually very curious where they know I talk about tech and they see all these things. And so for them, they always want to know what's happening with things. And then I kind of actually let their questions drive it. But we focus on some of these underlying principles again of like, hey, can we all agree selfishness is really bad? And like, let's talk about why is selfish bad? Like, why does getting what you want sometimes lead to your utter destruction? We just had a conversation. I had one with my son the other day. We are going to get the garbage cans. And we had just watched a Mr. Beast video where they were talking about, well, this island is $1 and then $1 million and then 15, whatever, whatever. And we talked about, do you think you'd be happy if you got the $1 million? He's like, no, then I'd want the 15. And I'm like, right. There's just this journey of that. And so then technology comes into the question of, I learn what they're doing with it. I learn how they're using it. And then I learn what things they wish they could do more of. And that drives just conversations of, well, let's talk about what that could look like. And, what risks might we need to be careful of together and really use it in that way. And yeah, there's times where, I mean, I have a thing, I'm like, you're not on social media right now. You're too young. I've seen way too much data on young kids and social media. Your brain and your identity is just not in a place where I think it's healthy for you to be on it. And, there's a little like, why not? And I'm like, well, let's talk about it.
Hmm.
And actually, I've found they're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But we do it together. It's not a daddy says.
Hmm.
And again, it's kind of a constant balancing act of figuring out where you draw the lines. And sometimes you draw them too dark and got to erase them a bit and kind of being flexible.
Speaking of dialogue, one thing that we talked about
Yeah.
in your episode was this cross-generational group or
Yep.
cross-generational community between older folks and younger folks. I'm not even going to specify the generations because I think it should exist regardless of the
Yeah.
generation, a specific generation. How should we start that? How do how do older folks admit that they may not know as much about technology, about the world, about the way the world works right now? And how do younger folks come to the conclusion that, hey, just because they are experts in certain ways with technology, just because they understand the way the world works in a very narrow sense, that they don't have the entire picture and that they need the wisdom and experience and mentorship from older folks?
So I don't know that, and this is the hard reality of it.
Mm.
I don't know that you can ever make someone humble,
Mm.
right? You can't make someone humble. They're either, that's something you have to decide for yourself, but there are definitely things you can do that can make it a lot harder for people to be humble. And going back to, we can all create an environment where either the people around us feel like it's a competition for who really has the most to contribute, or you can create an environment where we acknowledge that we all have parts of the puzzle and we can't put the puzzle together unless we each contribute the unique aspects of the puzzle that we have. And I think that whether you're a Gen Zer, whether you're whatever, like anybody can bring that to the table and be the voice that keeps reminding the people at the table that hey, that's actually what we're doing. And I know professionally, I tend to try and play that voice where I'm like, listen, I value and I truly value what you have to say on this. And I also have something to say. So can we just agree that we all have parts of the puzzle that the other one doesn't have?
Mhm.
And we'll figure out which puzzle pieces we need from everybody. But that really can be super helpful for bringing things down. So if you're a young person, of course, an older person's going to get defensive if they feel like you come in treating them like they're a moron and they don't know anything that's going on because they do have wisdom. They've been around the block, they've seen things. And if you act like, everything that happened before me was stupid, which
Right.
I was that 20-year-old, that looked at the world and went, a bunch of idiots. Why don't you just do all these things?
Right.
And when I finally went, well, but there's obviously a reason we do these things. And I actually would rather understand why and bring up the things that I'm curious about. And vice versa. The advice I give to the older folks who are like, yeah, well, we've got good reasons for this. Maybe you did, but can you at least acknowledge we're able to do things we've never been able to do before? And so maybe the reason that we did it before might have been totally legitimate in the past, but maybe it's not as legitimate now. And you can kind of create an environment that makes people more willing to be humble. But sometimes you're going to have the people that, you're like, well, I'm not going to change this. Well, I just struggle through this, so the next generation should too. Well, you're an arrogant blowhard, so get over it, and we're just going to kind of move on without you, type of a thing.
It's fantastic. No, it's yeah. There is an aspect of blame, particularly for Gen Z against older generations, where I'll speak for myself. I just feel like older generations really mucked up society and the world in irrevocable ways, but this proclivity to complain is not really going to fix anything. I think Gen Z are also in the
No.
prime years of building, creating, connecting, revitalizing the planet.
Well, and this recognition that if you study human history, I
Mhm.
think of the ecclesiastical wisdom of nothing is new under the sun. So all this stuff that we see where we go, well, that generation mucked it up. Well, guess what? There was a generation before that they mucked it up, and the generation that they mucked it up. And guess what? Your generation's going to muck some things up too. And when you can all kind of go, yeah, we're all going to screw this thing up. So maybe if we all got over ourselves and instead of thinking, if I was only the one in charge, we'd get this right. It's like, no, if I was the one in charge, I'd screw a bunch of stuff up too. So let's just kind of all recognize where we sit and then maybe we can work together.
Yeah, 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 yeah. As we were saying about making mistakes as a parent, we're all not perfect individually or collectively, and acknowledging that we will make mistakes, that there are growing pains, is one thing. But I think abdicating our responsibility to make the world a better place is a net loss.
Yes.
Last question. I think we've touched on this, but maybe if you have more distilled points, what advice do you have for Gen Z, in the domain of parenting or just lifestyle and careers?
Um, we've talked about a lot of stuff,
Mhm.
but
As we always do.
I think my thing, I think my biggest thing is I don't think, especially in my early 20s, if I were to go back and talk to me then, I did a lot of things without really thinking about my purpose and why am I doing this stuff? Like I was doing things because I just either that was what I was supposed to do or that's what someone else told me to do and or that's what I thought I needed to do. And I didn't spend enough time thinking about why and what's really underneath this. Even back, I think back when it was like, well, I want to make this much money. I never took the time to go, right, but why? Like, what do I think is going to happen when I get there? Because I think I could have avoided some of the mistakes I made if I actually took the time to think about those things, because I might have gone, oh, well, that's stupid. That's a really dumb and I might have spent more time thinking about what I was really trying to do and less time getting hung up in the details. And I think when you're young in your career, it's easy to do that. But I think, amidst everything else we've discussed, sometimes and AI is only pushing this. Just go faster, do more, be better, like just this constant rush of whatever. And we often, especially when you're young and energetic, and maybe that's why when you're older, it's a little easier because you're like, I'm just tired. I've got more time to do it. But I think actually taking the time, you're not wasting time to actually take the time to sit down and pause and think and reflect and spend time on that stuff rather than just going, well, maybe if I just run faster or go farther, I'll do better. It's like, well, actually, no, you might just make a lot more mistakes along the way.
Christopher, thank you so much for this conversation. It's always an absolute pleasure talking to you, exchanging ideas, and I mean this seriously, learning from you. You just have a, a well of wisdom to constantly uncover. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back and hopefully you continue, it helps you and I really truly am invested in the next generation and the generations to come. And I hope that they can learn from my mistakes because maybe someday we'll get into the Beanie Baby and zip tie ordeal from college and I'll tell that story.
Yeah,
That story.
yeah, Yeah. Stay tuned. Round 3 coming up soon.
All right. Sounds good.
Until next time.